first speaker today is Dr. Anand Ranganathan ji. Dr. Anand Ranganathan ji, if you permit me to say so, is a scientist by day and a political scientist by night, with a deep interest in finding a cure to malaria and tuberculosis. Clearly, a person with who has concern for the health of the nation. I wanted to ask you, sir, in regard to the Uniform Civil Code, we know that our country is presently standing, it's poised to become the Vishwaguru, poised to be known in the next 10 years as a developed country. In such a situation, how important is it to have a policy framework, to have a regulation and a law which helps its citizens in evolving, which takes care of the mental and physical health of every girl child, of every woman who is today unable to get inheritance? There are many communities, as we all know, who still practice child marriage and which is allowed by law. Then such is our situation. How important is Uniform Civil Code? And how could it really push our nation into becoming a Vishwaguru? Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much to the organizers, the Yashwini ji, Aishwarya ji, and all the exalted fellow panelists and speakers. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be part of this very important discussion. It really is a heartfelt thanks. For two reasons. One is that I am also a teacher, and I firmly believe that in domains where I do not have an expertise, well, I don't have an expertise in every domain, including science, but I've always believed that a teacher who stops being a student then stops being a teacher. And I think, as Aishwarya ji mentioned, away from 9 to 5, which is my science life, I delve into politics. But can I clarify that I've always believed that one should never mix politics with science, because then all you end up with is political science. But having said that, I think some issues transcend experts, expertise, and domains. And these issues are the ones that actually form the core of the country, the nation going forward. They might not address, they might not seek an apology or retribution or reconciliation for the crimes that have been committed in the past. But a nation has to look forward. A nation has to look towards the future. A nation that might not have cared for our past generations has to care for our future generations. And for that, Aishwarya ji, I think one of the most important resolutions one could bring about or policy changes would be the Uniform Civil Code. I firmly believe it's not just a necessity for India. I think it's a prerequisite for not only India as it stands today, but also for India's unity. Because religious fanatics may have held to ransom a generation previous to ours through partition. They may have held to ransom our generation through Shah Bano, as we all know. But we must not, and I dare say we will not, allow them to hold to ransom our future generation. Very simply, one sentence, we have to say no. No to religious fanatics, because enough is enough. So I just broadly want to touch on 4 issues, and then if time permits, after those 4 issues on which I deliberate very briefly, I would like to quote verbatim what people said during the Constitutional Assembly debates, because one must not, especially in issues as important as the Uniform Civil Code, I believe, deviate away from the facts, because then it becomes a domain of opinion making, and everyone has an opinion, but there are only set facts on which one must base one's opinion. So These are the four issues on which I have formed my opinions. And of course, these are based on facts and logic. So the first one is this pretext that people, the naysayers of UCC always give, which is that we have to have diversity. India is a land of multiple religions, people who are diverse, cultures that are diverse. So we have to respect that. I'm sorry. On the pretext of diversity, one cannot allow discrimination to flourish. And that is what has been happening. Let me give you just one example, and then it would make things very clear. Supreme Court very recently, last year, or maybe I think this January, it conferred Hindu daughters with equal rights to father's property, going back to 1949. And it said, and I quote, Hindu texts recognize female rights, unquote. This is what the Supreme Court said. But in India, in the same country that has the same Supreme Court, because of the Quranic verse 411, a Muslim daughter is entitled to only half of what a son is. I wonder, does this not bother our activists and those who are fighting for women's rights? What happens to all their speeches about equality and feminism and ending not just Brahminical patriarchy, but patriarchy? Cat gets their tongue when you quote this verse. Do they not have any sense of morality or ethics when it comes to discussing Muslim women's rights? Is this not discrimination? For how long will you make Muslim women suffer discrimination by shrouding them in this burqa of diversity? Just because you have a diverse culture or a religion that is different, or a law that is consecrated in that religion, a dogma, on the pretext of diversity, you would allow any discrimination to prosper. That's point number one, which is that in the garb of diversity or on the pretext of diversity, you must not allow discrimination to flourish. Point number two, and this is where logic comes in. There already is a sort of uniform civil code that is, or that has been applicable in Goa for decades. In fact, it's been there ever since we can remember, ever since the formation of Goa itself. And Goa has a minority population, Hindu, Muslims and Christians and non-Hindus, totaling 38%. 38% of Goa are minorities. So you tell me, are the minorities in Goa suffering, or are they being discriminated against because of the Uniform Civil Code? If they are, I haven't heard. On the contrary, the Goanese are very happy. So when the UCC, a sort of UCC that I have a lot of issues with, by the way, because I've read the UCC that is applicable in Goa, and it is heavily derived from what the Portuguese thought should be the Uniform Civil Code. And I think it's quite discriminatory in many aspects, but still it's in place. And Goanese don't seem to have any issue with that. So the point number two, the logic, point number one was that the naysayers were saying that we must have diversity. I have addressed that. Point number two, the naysayers were saying that people would be unhappy if the UCC comes. I have addressed that. Point number three is that the Uniform Civil Code is enshrined in our constitution under the directive principles. It is part of our constitution. So when you say constitution as a book is more important to me than any religious book, some say, then why are you being a naysayer there when you already have the UCC as part of the constitution? And clause A of this point number three is that none other than Dr. Ambedkar was a proponent of it. In fact, he rejected amendments of exceptionality that were proposed by Muslim legislators to Article 35, which is now Article 44 Directive Principles, that asks for the UCC to be implemented. Quote, I personally do not understand why religion should be given this vast, expansive jurisdiction as to cover the whole of life and to prevent the legislature from encroaching upon that field. After all, what are we having this liberty for? We are having this liberty in order to reform our social system, which is so full of inequities, discriminations, and other things, which conflict with our fundamental rights. Unquote. This is Dr. Ambedkar. Besides, the UCC has been ordered to be implemented on more than one occasion by the courts themselves, most famously in the Shah Bano case. Quote, a common civil code will help the cause of national integration by removing disparate loyalties to laws which have conflicting ideologies, unquote. So, Ambedkar ki nahi sunni, Supreme Court ki nahi sunni, Constitution ki nahi sunni, kiski sunni hai? Sharia ki. And by the way, for bringing in social reforms and equality to Hindu society, the same Congress gladly brought in the Hindu Code Bill, but it cowered away like a, as I say, wet cat when it came to reforming Muslim society. Why? I repeat, I am against any law or code that discriminates between gender, sex, caste, creed, religious denomination, communities, or groups. Finally, on point number 4, and this is very dear to me, because I firmly believe that above everything, there is a pursuit of a law or a code that begets what I call universal good. By universal good, I mean that I want a law that is just, equal, and based on science. Because to be honest, only then can societies progress. And I'm not saying anything new because we've seen this time and again. Let's take a couple of examples. The abortion limit has been decided, has it not, by science? And it has changed over years. Right now, it is, I think, 22 weeks. It wasn't that to begin with. Now, I ask you, was this scientific intervention, call it scientific medical, was that not warranted? Similarly is the case with infant vaccination, contraception, which is prohibited in many societies. Was that not warranted? I ask you, in many societies that prohibit vaccination, what do you want? You want your children to die or to be afflicted with polio just because in the name of diversity, you want the constitutional article that says you are free to actually, accept the tenets of your religion and to follow your religion. You have a constitutional right. Do you have a constitutional right to kill babies or to make them suffer or to make them disabled for the rest of their lives just because of this diversity? Is it because of this diversity that you would not allow your child to get vaccinated against horrendous diseases, including polio? So is scientific intervention having this uniform law of, it is in fact called universal vaccination, was that not warranted? Similarly, science tells us that marriage of a woman upon puberty, which is sanctioned in Islam, which is demanded by the All India Muslim Personal Law Board, which is ratified by the Indian courts as recently as a couple of years ago by the Gujarat High Court. Incidentally, the judge that ratified it is now in the Supreme Court. I don't want to say more because there already is a contempt case against me, but luckily we have an exalted honorable judge as one of our audience, so maybe he would help me out. But the fact of the matter is that if we have a child marriage or the marriage of a woman that is religiously sanctioned upon puberty, it causes irreversible physical and mental damage to the woman's body. Science has told us this. Medicine has told us this. Scientific research has told us this. But should we continue to cause this irreversible physical and mental damage to a child or a woman in the name of diversity? You want to continue to marry girl childs because your community has been doing so? while every other community in India has to follow the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act? I ask again the feminists and other people who fight for women's rights, is this pro-woman? So as I said, the Universal Civil Code will eradicate discrimination. It will unify us. It will not divide us. And its time has come. Finally, just a minute, I want to delve on the debates that happened on, in fact, precisely 23rd November 1948. There was a very robust debate on the exact framing of the article of our Constitution concerning the Uniform Civil Code. And this happened on 23rd November 1948. It's a debate that included luminaries such as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and Dr. K.M. Munshi, among others. When the Muslim members of the assembly proposed that the Civil Code article that simply stated, quote, the state shall endeavor to secure its citizen a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India, unquote. When they said it was tyrannical to the minorities and an example of the majority riding roughshod over the rights of the minorities, and that it should have a clause mentioning that the Uniform Civil Code would be applicable to every Indian, with the exception of those who are following their personal laws. That is, quote, provided that nothing in this article shall affect the personal law of the citizen, unquote. Mr. Munshi had this to say. A further argument has been advanced that the enactment of a civil code would be tyrannical to the minorities. Is it tyrannical? Nowhere in advanced Muslim countries, the personal law of each minority has been recognized as so sacrosanct as to prevent the enactment of a civil code. Take, for instance, Turkey or Egypt. No minority in these countries is permitted to have such rights. But I go further. When the Sharia Act was passed on, when certain laws were passed in the central legislature in the old regime, the Khojas and the Kachi Memons were highly dissatisfied. They then followed certain Hindu customs for generations. Since they became converts, they had done so. They did not want to conform to the Sharia. And yet, by a legislation of the central legislature, some Muslim members who felt that Shariat law should be enforced upon the whole community carried their point. The Khojas and the Kachi Memons most unwillingly had to submit to it. Where were the rights of the minority then? When you want to consolidate a community, you have to take into consideration the benefit which may accrue to the whole community and not to the customs or a part of it. It is not therefore correct to say that such an act is tyranny of the majority. If you will look at the countries in Europe which have a civil code, everyone who goes there from any part of the world and every minority has to submit to that civil code. It is not felt to be tyrannical to the minority. The point, however, is this: whether we are going to consolidate and unify our personal law in such a way that the way of life of the whole country may in course of time be unified and secular. We want to divorce religion from personal law, from what may be called social relations, or from the rights of parties as regards inheritance or succession. What have these things got to do with religion? I really fail to understand. Take, for instance, the Hindu law draft, which is before the Legislative Assembly. If one looks at Manu and Yajnavalkya and the rest of them, I think most of the provisions of the new bill will run counter to their injunctions. But after all, we are an advancing society. We are in a stage where we must unify and consolidate the nation by every means without interfering with religious practices. If, however, the religious practices in the past have been so construed as to cover the whole field of life, we have reached a point where we must put our foot down and say that these matters are not religion, they are purely matters for secular legislation. This is what happened almost 75 years ago. And we think we are advanced now. Look at the enormity of the situations that were being tackled right after we had got partitioned. This is the kind of openness with which things were being discussed, where you were not just thinking of a particular community or a particular sect within that community. You were thinking of unifying the country. And here we believe that in the garb of diversity, we bring in discrimination. We follow the laws that discriminate within people of that community. And we believe we are advancing towards a future that is progressive. I'm sorry. It is not progressive. It is regressive. Thank you very much. I shall end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anandji.
Thank you so much.
What we derive from your talk is that there is a lack of political courage. And this government has shown at least an interest to have UCC, and that is commendable. Your point on the fact that you said, can diversity justify inhuman violence? As in something that all our students, everybody who's here can ponder upon. I think that's a very, very strong statement, that an argument that I think we should all seriously sort of consider. Thank you very much, Anand Ranganathanji. We understand that you are in between a G20 debate, a live stream that is happening. But thank you for taking out the time and joining us and sharing your views on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Most kind. Thank you so much.
Anand Ranganathanji also spoke about Brahminical patriarchy and how patriarchy has been shown to be Brahminical in nature, as in just the coining of this word is so unfortunate. But what is patriarchy really?